I grew up in a Chinese Catholic conservative household, which meant it was pretty black and white, what was considered proper and acceptable. And if I was anything outside of that neat little box, well, I'd be too much. I'd get in a ton of trouble, and frankly, I'd be a disgrace. And being born into a girl's body, I realized very early on that who I was and the version of me that my family, my community, my cultural expectations wanted me to be were different. And what I didn't have words for at that time was I was a transgender man. See, I wanted my hair short. I hated wearing dresses. I wanted to do martial arts and breakdancing. I wanted to run around while everyone else wanted me to sit still and be quiet. And it was very clear that from the beginning that who I fundamentally was too much. I was too loud, too dramatic, too naughty, too energetic, too much of a boy. In the eyes of my family and my community, who I was just wrong. And so I thought maybe one day they'll finally change their minds and I'll finally be free to be authentically me. And so I waited and I waited until finally at 19 I realized it wasn't coming. See, up until that point, I had lived, looked like, dressed the part of the model little girl that everybody wanted me to be, just so I could win the approval of my family and community. And for a short-lived moment, I did. But it came at a steep price. See, every day, I felt suffocated and trapped. And it simply didn't feel like living. It simply didn't feel like living, having to exist within a shell of who I truly was. Halloween is a holiday and it's fun and games, but it becomes a living nightmare when the costume that you have on, well, you can't remove it or wash it off, no matter how hard you try. So I started looking. I looked all over the internet for the answer to the most simple yet complex question: who am I? And it wasn't until I went down a rabbit hole of YouTube videos and I found a video of a transgender man sharing his story and his journey, and instantly a light bulb went off in my head. This makes so much sense. This is who I am. And they say when you find the one, you just know. And in that moment, I instantly knew that this was the version of me that I had been looking for. But now that I knew, where do I go from here? See, up until that point, I never even met a transgender person before in my life, and I had no clue what to expect or what the transition journey would even look like. And so, for me, I just discovered this part of me, this paradigm of me that completely shattered who I thought I was, and I had no clear roadmap of where to go from here. And on top of that, the decision-making process was tormenting. I knew there was no going back. I knew that there was no going back and that this would be permanent. And my decision would not only irrevocably change my life, but the lives of everyone in my life. And so I thought, maybe I'd go to a support group and they'd be able to offer me some comfort or a light at the end of this tunnel. But instead, it did the complete opposite. I heard story after story of other transgender men and women just like me that were rejected and ostracized. Stories of homelessness and poverty, jobs lost, relationships severed. I was told that there was a very real possibility I could lose everything and everyone in my life. My family, my friends, my home. I was told to expect the worst. And so I was at a crossroad, and I was terrified. See, many times when we come up against difficult crossroads in our lives, it can feel like we have no other choice, like our hand is forced. And that's what it felt like. If I chose to be who I truly was, I might lose my family and my friends, and it seemed like a lose-lose situation. Now, who would want to possibly lose their family and friends? Who would want to possibly be ostracized and rejected? See, I was 19 at the time. I had no money, no job. And it was a very real possibility I could get kicked out of my home and be homeless. On the other hand, I can continue living as a pretend version of who I was, continuing to hide, miserable, trapped, and empty. And so either way, the price was steep. And either way, the price was uncomfortable. And that's when I realized that despite being terrified, that I was actually willing to lose everything and everyone in my life, because living a life trapped, being a made-up version of who I was, simply wasn't living. And so I stopped waiting for the green light of approval from the world, and I finally gave myself permission to be who I always authentically was, a man. And in my journey to transitioning, it's a big theme of me grappling with what it means to be free. And for each of us, we all struggle in different ways in our lives every single day with what it truly means to be free and the different areas where we feel trapped, constricted, restricted, possibly your job or relationships or how to express yourself. And I'm curious, when was the last time you felt like your hand was forced, like you had no other way but to give up a piece of your freedom? And in the past 2 years, the topic of freedom has never been more relevant, controversial, and polarizing. Between vaccines and mandates and travel bans, quarantine requirements, the list can go on. And things we used to do on autopilot, like going for coffee with a friend or traveling to almost anywhere around the world, was now restricted in ways that we haven't experienced in recent history. And so the million-dollar question is, how can I be free in a world that seems to be more and more constricting by the moment, with less and less that seems to be within our control? See, often the conversation of freedom focuses on something that is missing an important point. And while we look a lot of times at our external circumstances, what we're often not looking at is how, despite those circumstances, we always have the freedom to choose. The definition of freedom is the right or power to say, think, or do as one wants without restraint or hindrance. And I think that definition is missing an important fine print that we often glaze over or ignore altogether, and that is with a price. Now, every single day we come across different crossroads in our lives where the level of severity and the stake is different. We always have multiple choice points, like, do I stay at my job or do I leave to build my own business? Do I get vaccinated or not? Do I stay or leave a country that is facing oppression? Or do I speak up or not speak up at the possible risk of losing my job or the relationships closest to me or possibly even my life? And for me, it was, do I transition? Do I become my authentic self? And in those moments, there's always a price to pay, something we're willing to lose. And it can be a range, anywhere from our comfort and our reputation, all the way to our health and possibly even our lives. And you might think, well, what if I don't want to choose? But here's the thing, is that when we refuse to make a conscious choice, that is when we're actually the least free. Because with indecision, we become victim of circumstance. And the greatest freedom fighters of our time understood that. We think about Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, the famous five, Harvey Milk. Well, what each of them were fighting for, the common through line between all of them is that they all understood that despite the oppression they were facing, they always had the power to choose what they wanted to speak up and stand up for, despite the prices that may come with their choices. So the million-dollar question isn't actually, what is freedom? But what is the price that we're willing to pay for freedom? See, in my journey to transitioning, what I didn't realize at the time was that you can change your name, you can change the way you look, you can change your entire identity. But the way that you experience freedom doesn't automatically change with it. See, I jumped through extraordinary hoops to become my authentic self. Years of surgeries and medical complications, legal barriers, relational setbacks. And while after I'd finished transitioning, I didn't want anyone to find out that I was a transgender man. See, while I was now physically free to be my authentic self, I was now ironically trapped by something different. And that was the shame of my past and my identity. And I was so overcome with anxiety and fear of rejection that I would constantly self-sabotage myself. I couldn't even say the word transgender. And in my path to self-sabotage, I was affecting my mental health, my physical health, and my relationships. And it wasn't until I found myself working a 6-figure job, living in a penthouse, completely empty on the inside, and my marriage on the verge of separation, that I realized something drastically needed to change, or else I was going to end up losing everything and everyone in my life. And see, up until that point, I hadn't even told my wife's family or my coworkers or any of my social circles. The only people that knew were my family, my wife, and the people that knew me prior to my transition. And the reason why I didn't want to tell anyone was I was afraid. I was afraid of rejection and being ostracized. I was afraid of someone wanting to hurt me or possibly even kill me because they don't like people like me. But then I realized that what I was trying to protect myself on the outside was slowly killing me on the inside. And so I knew that what I wanted more than anything was to be free. And I knew the only way to create that was to be courageous, one moment at a time, one conversation at a time. And so, one by one, I started telling people close to me. Literally sick to my stomach. It started with people closest to me, and then my acquaintances, my friends, and much to my surprise, most of them were accepting of me. And that's when I realized my biggest barrier to my own freedom was actually myself. And so I thought, if my family, who I thought for sure would reject me, and they actually accept me, what if the world would too? And so I decided once and for all to come out to everyone that I knew, to give myself permission to be fully seen as my authentic self for the first time. And so, on July 21st of 2020, completely terrified, I pressed post, and I came out to the world. And although I couldn't control everyone's reactions, the freedom I felt in that moment was so real. And the gift that I gave myself was the experience of what it felt to be fully free. And in the midst of a global pandemic, when our freedom was the most restricted in our recent history, with where we could or couldn't go, what we could or couldn't do, who we could or could not see, I had never felt so free in my entire life. And isn't it so interesting that my experience of freedom was the most uninhibited and liberated that it's ever been at a time when I was the most physically restricted? And it really made me think about what is freedom? And it really made me realize that it actually has nothing to do with what's outside of me. See, we're both the guard and the prisoner of our own invisible prisons. And what often keeps us safe is also what keeps us from being free. And each of us always has the power to open that door and step outside of it at any time. We each hold the key to unlocking our freedom. And it starts with activating, working out our choice muscle, and activating our courage. When was the last time that you spoke up for what you authentically believed in, even though you were outnumbered? And when was the last time that you wanted to pursue something in your life, but you held back on it because you were afraid it wouldn't work out? See, it's easy to want to choose the most convenient default option of having other people or our circumstances choose for us. It's so much easier to live our lives in the passenger seat, having life happen to us. But if we truly want to be in the driver's seat of our lives, it's going to require us making uncomfortable choices outside of our comfort zones. So practice courage. It doesn't have to start with something big. It can start with something small, one area in your life that you can focus on being outside of your comfort zone. Because when we start activating our courage, we start collecting evidence of what we're capable of, making less scary the uncomfortable choices we got to make every day. And when we activate our freedom to choose, we put a stake in the ground that our choice matters, our voice matters, our vote matters. And lastly, what is the price that you're willing to pay? What are you willing to let go of to have what you want? Are you willing to let go of comfort, looking good? Are you willing to let go of even bigger things, possibly the job you've had for years or your relationship? Or what's even more terrifying, the belief system that things will always be this way in order to have what you truly want, which is peace, joy, and freedom. See, what many people do not realize is that I almost lost my life in my pursuit of freedom. And after one of my surgeries, one that was supposed to be easy and recover quickly from, my recovery went sideways. And one by one, my organs started shutting down throughout the week because of massive internal bleeding that I didn't even know about. And after 3 ER visits, finally being admitted into the hospital and being rushed off into surgery, I was told by the nurse afterwards that if I had come in any later, that I would have died. Was I ever scared that I could have lost my life in pursuit of my freedom? Absolutely, yes. But what I wanted on the other side was so much bigger that it couldn't hold me back from taking that leap of faith and going for it anyways. And every day, we are faced with circumstances that are outside of our control. It could be traffic or our family or the outcome of a pandemic. But when we realize that freedom actually exists not in the circumstance, but in our ability to choose despite those circumstances, then now they're happening around you, not to you. You can be empowered in your choice. And when we realize that, we can be free as Nelson Mandela was inside of a jail cell. We can be free in World War II concentration camps, just as Viktor Frankl was. And we can be free even if the world doesn't approve of us. And when we realize that we are the sole uncontested author of our lives, then we hold onto the sovereignty of our existence. And while we may not be able to always control what happens outside of us, our circumstances and our conditions, what we can always control is who we can be in it. And it is when we realize that the only permission we ever needed to be free was the one from inside of us, that we can finally experience freedom from the inside out. Thank you very much.